The evening light in New York was fading, the city below breathing its usual rhythm. Sirens, laughter, traffic, life. Up in his Tribeca apartment, Robert De Niro sat by the window, watching it all from a distance. The man who had once defined the pulse of the screen now seemed still, as though the world outside had moved on without him. A small notebook rested on the table beside a half-empty glass of red wine. Its pages were covered in uneven handwriting, words written with trembling fingers. Not a script, not a character, just fragments of thought, the last reflections of a man who had spent his life pretending to be everyone but himself. For over half a century, De Niro had been the heartbeat of American cinema, the gangster, the soldier, the father, the sinner, the savior. His face was carved into film history, his silence more powerful than most men's speeches. But here in this quiet room, the legend was gone. Only the man remained. The walls around him were lined with memories, black and white photos from Taxi Driver, awards gathering dust, letters from Scorsese. Yet none of them comforted him now. He looked at a photo of himself from years ago, eyes fierce, posture proud, and whispered, "Who was that guy?" He picked up the notebook again, reading the last line he had written. It was a confession, raw and simple. "I spent my life chasing truth on screen, but I never found it in myself." Outside, the skyline shimmered like an old film reel, flickering between light and darkness. Inside, Robert De Niro took a deep breath, his reflection caught faintly in the glass. Half man, half memory. For the first time, there were no cameras, no characters, no takes. Only the truth, waiting to be told. Long before he became the quiet storm of American cinema, Robert De Niro was just a boy growing up in the streets of Manhattan, a city that, even in the 1940s, felt like a battlefield for dreamers. He was born in 1943, the only child of two artists, Virginia Admiral, a painter with fierce conviction, and Robert De Niro Sr., a talented but tormented abstract expressionist. Their home was filled with canvases, books, and the smell of turpentine, but not stability. When Robert was just 2 years old, his parents separated. His father had come out as gay, a revelation that, in post-war America, carried shame and misunderstanding. Though his mother raised him, De Niro Sr. remained a haunting presence in his life, distant yet ever felt. Young Robert grew up watching him paint, lost in solitude and melancholy. "My father lived in his own world," De Niro would later say. "I think I inherited that." He was a shy child, quiet to the point of invisibility. Other kids played ball in the streets. Robert escaped into movies. The dark theaters of Little Italy became his sanctuary, places where he could disappear into someone else's story. Watching actors like Brando and Montgomery Clift, he felt something awaken, a strange connection to their loneliness, their fire. His mother supported him, working long hours as a typist to pay for acting classes. His father, though proud, worried. "Art will break your heart," he told him once, "but it's the only thing worth being broken for." Those words would become prophecy. At 16, De Niro dropped out of high school to pursue acting full-time. He joined small theater groups, rehearsed in cramped basements, lived off cheap pizza and cigarettes. Directors noticed his intensity. Even then, his silence carried more weight than most actors' dialogue. He didn't act to be seen. He acted to survive. Yet behind that discipline was a boy still chasing something. The approval of a father who never quite belonged to the world. In the security of a home that had dissolved before he could remember it. His drive wasn't born of ambition, but absence. Years later, when asked about his childhood, he rarely spoke of it. It wasn't bad, he'd say, but his eyes told another story, one of isolation, of a boy who learned too early how to hide emotion and call it strength. That root, the quiet pain of growing up in the shadow of genius, art, and abandonment, became the foundation of every role he would ever play. Because before he learned how to become others, Robert De Niro had already mastered the hardest role of all, pretending he didn't need anyone. The city that raised him would soon become the stage that defined him. In his early 20s, Robert De Niro wandered through New York like a restless ghost, half dreamer, half observer. The grit, The noise, the loneliness of the streets all became part of him. He studied at the Stella Adler Conservatory, where he learned the craft of transforming pain into presence. Adler pushed him hard. "You don't act emotions," she told him. "You become them." And De Niro did, with terrifying precision. He was 27 when he caught the attention of a young filmmaker named Martin Scorsese. Their first collaboration, Mean Streets, changed everything. On screen, De Niro was raw, unpredictable, a powder keg in human form. His character, Johnny Boy, wasn't written to be legendary, but when De Niro stepped into the role, he didn't just play the man, he created him. He spoke the language of chaos fluently because he'd lived it. From there, the fire never stopped. The Godfather Part 2, Taxi Driver, Raging Bull. Each role was a mirror, reflecting not only the dark corners of the human soul, but also the unspoken parts of his own. For Taxi Driver, he drove New York cabs at night for weeks, absorbing the city's madness until he became it. For Raging Bull, he gained 60 pounds, transforming his body into Jake LaMotta's broken shell. Every performance was a ritual, a small death, and the audience could feel it. When asked why he worked so hard, he once replied, "I don't know any other way to live." But behind that relentless drive was the echo of the boy from Manhattan, still chasing the approval of a father, still trying to earn his place in a world that demanded proof of existence. Off-screen, fame never interested him. He rarely gave interviews, avoided tabloids, and treated the Hollywood machine with quiet disdain. He spoke through his characters, men of few words but enormous gravity. When he did speak in person, his sentences were short, hesitant, sometimes awkward. But when the cameras rolled, he spoke in a language deeper than words, the language of truth. By the 1990s, De Niro was not just an actor. He was a myth, the embodiment of American cinema itself. Critics called him the face of realism. Directors called him the soul of the screen. But with every success, something inside him seemed to retreat further. He once said to Scorsese, half jokingly, "You know, maybe we spend so much time pretending to be other people that we forget who we are." Marty smiled, but De Niro didn't. The fire that burned so brightly on screen had begun to leave scars off it. Sleepless nights, broken relationships, a growing fatigue that no applause could heal. Yet he kept going, because the only time he ever felt truly alive was when he disappeared into someone else. He had mastered the art of becoming, but he had never learned the art of being. Time, even for legends, is merciless. By the 2010s, Robert De Niro had already lived several lifetimes, each one caught on celluloid, the rebel, the fighter, the icon. But away from the screen, the man behind the myth was growing quieter, slower, heavier with reflection. He still worked. He had to. Acting wasn't just what he did, it was how he stayed alive. Yet there was a weariness that no director could edit out. His movements became more deliberate, his pauses longer, his eyes softer. Those who worked with him in his later years noticed the change. He wasn't chasing anything anymore, one crew member said. He was just remembering. But the remembering came with a cost. In 2018, De Niro's health began to decline. The pain in his back, once dismissed as age, grew worse. Doctors warned him to rest, but rest felt like surrender. He'd built his life on discipline, on pushing through pain. Actors don't retire, he told a friend. They fade into their own stories. Behind closed doors, the solitude deepened. His long marriage to Grace Hightower had ended. His children were grown, and the apartment in Tribeca, once filled with laughter and dinners that stretched past midnight, had become a shrine of silence. He'd walk through it at night, looking at the old posters, the photographs, the awards. None of them spoke back. He was still revered, still respected. But Hollywood had changed. The faces were younger now, the pace faster, the stories louder. De Niro remained like a mountain surrounded by new storms, unshaken but slowly eroding. He spent his evenings alone, often in the same spot by the window, a glass of wine beside him, jazz playing faintly in the background. He had built his empire on roles that demanded control, but life, in its cruel irony, had taken control from him. Memory began to slip. Lines blurred between scenes he had acted and moments he had lived. Sometimes he'd start telling a story from Taxi Driver as if it had really happened. Still, he resisted pity. When friends asked if he was afraid of growing old, he smiled. Nah, he'd say, I've been rehearsing death my whole life. Every character I ever killed off was a little piece of me anyway. But when the lights were off, when the visitors had gone, the silence became heavier. Not peaceful, but suffocating. His reflection in the glass no longer looked like the man who had once stared into mirrors and asked, "You talking to me?" Now it was a stranger, one who had spent so long pretending to be others that he'd forgotten who Robert really was. He began writing more, small notes, fragments of memory, regrets he never voiced aloud. One of them read, "The hardest part of living long isn't losing others. It's watching yourself disappear one piece at a time." The world still saw him as untouchable, but behind those eyes, behind the legend, there was just a man confronting his own mortality. Not with fear, but with a kind of weary curiosity. The silence, once his tool as an actor, had become his companion. And in that silence, he began to face the one role he could never rehearse, his final one. In the last months of his life, Robert De Niro's days moved like slow scenes in a film he no longer controlled. The apartment in Tribeca, the one he had filled with art, scripts, and memories of an entire career, had grown still. The laughter, the shouting, the arguments that once fueled his fire were gone. Only the hum of the city below reminded him that life outside still carried on. He had stopped working. His body couldn't keep up anymore, and his doctors insisted he rest. For a man who had spent a lifetime chasing truth through motion, stillness felt unnatural, almost cruel. Yet in that stillness, something began to shift. He began to reflect not on his fame or his films, but on what and who he had lost along the way. He missed his father most. Even after decades, the wound of their distance never fully healed. De Niro often spoke of him softly with reverence and guilt. "He was brilliant," he'd whisper. "I just didn't tell him that enough." One night he found himself sitting in front of one of his father's old paintings, tracing the brushstrokes with his fingers. The colors, bold, lonely, desperate, told the story of both their lives. Two artists, forever searching for connection, finding it too late. He also missed his children. Fame had given them everything, except him. He had been there physically, but not always emotionally. His love was silent, practical, almost shy. Now, as age stole his strength, he longed to say what he never could. A few weeks before his death, his daughter Drina visited him. They talked quietly for hours, about life, family, and the strange emptiness of success. Before she left, he held her hand tightly and said, "You know, I've played men who killed, men who broke, men who lost everything. But the only thing I ever feared losing was the people I love." It was the closest thing to an apology he ever gave. In those final days, he wrote often in his notebook, the same one found beside him after he passed. On one of the last pages, the handwriting shaky and uneven, he wrote, "All my life I thought the camera was my confessional, but confession means nothing if you never forgive yourself." That line would later appear in tributes and documentaries, quoted by actors who had idolized him. A final act of honesty from a man who had spent a lifetime hiding behind roles. As his body weakened, he asked for no visitors, no pity, only peace. He would sit near the window at dusk, watching the city light up. The same skyline that had watched him rise from a struggling actor to a legend. Sometimes he would smile faintly and murmur, "It's all still there, just without me in it." On one of his last evenings, a close friend asked him if he was afraid. De Niro shook his head. "Nah, death's just another take. You just hope the director's satisfied." When he passed, it was quiet. No pain, no grand farewell. Just the sound of the city, sirens far away, the soft hum of traffic, the whisper of rain against glass. The man who had once filled the world with noise left it in silence. Later, when his children opened his notebook, they found one final entry. "If they remember me, I hope it's not for being fearless." I was never fearless. I was just good at pretending. And somehow that made sense, because Robert De Niro had never needed to be fearless. He only needed to be real. When the news of Robert De Niro's passing broke, the world didn't react with noise. It reacted with silence. For a man whose power had always lived in stillness, that felt right. There were no grand speeches, no elaborate ceremonies, just headlines that felt heavier than usual. The end of an era. Across the world, cinemas dimmed their lights. Directors paused in their work. Actors posted photos. Not red carpet shots, but quiet moments. Scorsese wrote, "There was no one like him. He didn't perform, he revealed." Al Pacino said, "I lost my brother in art. We lived in the same silence." Tribeca, the neighborhood De Niro had rebuilt after 9/11, became a shrine of candles and flowers. People gathered outside his restaurant, his film center, his apartment, whispering lines from Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, The Irishman. They didn't mourn the movie star. They mourned the man who had taught them that strength could live inside vulnerability, that rage could hide love, and that silence could speak louder than words. His funeral was private, just as he'd wished. No cameras, no headlines, just family and a handful of friends. They played Miles Davis softly, drank wine, and read aloud pieces of his notebook. One line made everyone smile through tears. "If you ever wondered who I really was, look between the lines. That's where I left myself." His children said he wanted no grave, no monument. He said the city is his graveyard, one of them recalled. He wanted to live in it forever. And in a way, he does. Every time a young actor whispers instead of shouts, every time a director lingers a little longer on silence, every time a story chooses truth over spectacle, that's De Niro, still teaching, still haunting, still present. In the end, Robert De Niro's legacy wasn't just in the films. It was in the courage to show the world what it means to be human, raw, flawed, unafraid to break. Some say legends never die, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe they simply dissolve into the city lights, into the reel of memory, into every quiet moment when the world finally pauses to listen. And somewhere, in that stillness, you can almost hear his voice again, low, steady, timeless. "It's not about being perfect, kid. It's about being real, right up to the end."